Hello, everybody. I'm sorry we're starting a minute or so late, but welcome tonight. I'm Carol Willis. I hope you can see me here in the background. I'm the director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to one of our regular book talks. This one's rather different in its focus than our usual New York history or skyscrapers. We're going to LA to look at the other coast and the other city and some of the key urban issues which always interest us at the museum. Our speaker tonight is James Sanders, who is a longtime friend of the museum and of mine, I have to say, a really multi-talented individual who is an architect, he's an author, he is a screenwriter, who has documented the history of New York with Rick Burns in the multi-part series, more than I think 13 parts of New York, a documentary history, and has yet another than 20 years later look at the future of cities and New York in a kind of postscript to that original PBS series. James has been a scholar and a devoted lover of movies for his entire life, and so it's a natural that LA, what would be a counterpart, as LA is a one industry town in terms of the dreams of the movies. In the same way that James has looked at the fictional New York or the documentary New York in film in a book that he did called Celluloid Skyline. So putting together the bi-coastal and the two-city obsession of James Sanders and translating it also into the future, this book, Renewing the Dream, looks at the subtitle, as you can see, The Mobility Revolution and the Future of Los Angeles. But James comes as both a historian and also as someone who is facilitating a kind of narrative that's crafted around some work of a firm, Woods Bagot, that he's been working with for some time. And so he's edited and he's produced this book. And I'm going to introduce Matt Stevenson, who is the project or the studio head for Woods Bagot on the West Coast. Excuse me. You're not, if you're on the East Coast in the New York office. And he will introduce Matt Ducharme, who is one of the contributors of the projects that are featured in this book. But James will introduce the second Matt more completely. I'm going to hand it over to Matt Stevenson in order to introduce James a little bit more and the conception of this project. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you again to Carol and the Skyscraper Museum for hosting this tonight. My name is Matt Stevenson. I am a principal in the New York studio of Woods Bagot Architects. And we're really excited about this project and about James jumping in and editing and contributing to this book and accepting the challenge with all of us. Really exciting throughout that book. And as Carol mentioned, really focused on some of the LA urban environments, but we're also really excited about what lessons learned that could have for some of our other cities around the world. So I think there's been a great intro already for James and Matt, and thank you for being here. And I'll let James come up and start speaking.
Thank you, Matt. So we are here on the circumstance of the publication of our book, Renewing the Dream, which was published a few months ago by Rizzoli, a wonderful publishing house that I have a great relationship with. And it's terrific to be here at the intersection of so many friends and colleagues. The Skyscraper Museum, in addition to Carol being a friend, I've been on the board of this museum for some time, and it's just, as most of you know, just a wonderful, wonderful place. And about 7 years ago, I was asked by Nick Corrales, who's the CEO of Woods Bagot, if I would be up for serving in a consulting basis to help the firm, which is a global firm. They have offices in about 15, 16 cities around the world. Think about the future of cities and think about the future of architecture. And I jumped at the chance. And the city that we landed on as our area of focus was Los Angeles, in part because, as Carol says, is a longtime interest of mine, inevitably working on the American film industry as I did in Celluloid Skyline. I had to go to California and go to Hollywood and learn how movies were made. And then that caught me up with the history and fascination of the city as a whole. Woods Bagot, in turn, was opening and enlarging their office. They have a wonderful studio in the Bradbury building, for those of you who know LA. So for all those reasons, in 2018, it seemed to make sense to begin to use Los Angeles as an area of study. And it is, in my view, the great other city of the United States, with all due respect to Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston. Those cities, in many ways, are built on the same morphology as New York, centralized, transit-driven historically, as opposed to this entire other model of Los Angeles, which really is a polynucleated, decentralized city, but with interesting big city issues, in their way, not different than New York. So we began in 2018 by thinking about and studying what jumped up to us as a fascinating issue of Los Angeles, which was parking in a city so devoted to the automobile. And we did a major study at the time in 2018, the results of which were so compelling that I suggested to Nick that instead of just sort of putting it on a shelf, that we double down and build a book out of it. So we asked contributors to come in, some of the most distinguished scholars and writers we'll be mentioning, who think about Los Angeles and the future of the city, new design projects that we were developing, and word got out, as it were. And in 2020, Christopher Hawthorne, who was the chief design officer of Los Angeles, actually asked Woods Bagot, along with a very distinguished group of other firms, to come up with some new ideas that had to do with EVs. But the broad notion of the project was expanded beyond parking into be the relationship of generally mobility and the future of Los Angeles. What we've done is structured the book in 3 parts. And the first part, which is called Battle of Los Angeles, actually takes the form of the kind of epic debate that's gone on for pretty close to 100 years about Los Angeles, and specifically the relationship of the way people get around the city with the kinds of buildings and specifically housing that are built in the city. We took Christopher's roughly 3-part idea. He called it the first, second, and third Los Angeles. We called it LA 3.0. The basic construction is the idea that until 1945, the city of Los Angeles was built around the boulevard and the streetcar. Those of you who've seen the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit will know what I'm talking about here. Post-war Los Angeles, of course, was very different. It was based on the freeway and the tract house. And it became not only the model that rebuilt the region of Los Angeles, but really the model of all new cities all over the world. You go to any modern city, and you will see something roughly based on what Los Angeles was doing in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But our argument has been that since 2000, something new has arrived. LA 3.0, as we call it. A city that, while still very much, freeways haven't gone anywhere and its tract houses are still there, they do not represent the future of Los Angeles anymore. Instead, a whole series of new developments is arising. And we decided to track those developments, put them in the context of this great battle that's gone on about what LA should be, and then think a little bit about the future. Once again, I will go here. Here we go. So to talk about the dream, the really post-war dream of Los Angeles, is to talk about the dream of living in a city in your own home. Now, older cities had suburbs, but they were usually at the edge of the city, and they were tied to the center of the city, the central business district, with a with a transit system. Los Angeles was different. The suburb became the city. There was a downtown, but it didn't have the same relationship. It was not the big kind of CBD you had in eastern cities. Instead, the heart of the city, the heart of the dream of the city, was your single family homestead on your single plot of land, with your rolling version of your single family homestead, which is to say your family car with its own home, the garage, which took you to the rest of the city. Now, whether it was the form of the David Hockney painting A Bigger Splash, or which was kind of the very upper end, or whether it was the kind of ordinary homely bungalow that Robert Ginder's painting shows on the right. This was the kind of the essence of the dream: the private home, the private tract of land, and the private car. To build that, of course, involved two kinds of parallel tracks. On the one hand, you had the construction of this enormous freeway infrastructure, enormous kind of limited access highways. You're seeing one of the very first on the right there, the Arroyo Seco Parkway, which opened in 1940 and was maybe the first freeway. And on the other hand, you had the construction of immense numbers of tract houses along the freeways. And you got a landscape that looked like this. It was not suburban and not rural. It was definitely urban, but it was this distinctively spread out, low density form of urban development. And along with it, of course, you also got the incredible focus on parking, because all those cars had to go somewhere when they were done with their journey. And what we track here in these two photographs by Ed Ruscha is the way the form of the city changed from being a sort of a hybrid. You see on the left, the May Company building, built in 1940, where the building sits on the street and has a sidewalk and street shop windows, and the parking is in the back, to the 1960s May Company on the right, where, as you see, the building has gone completely set back from the street. There is no street front. The parking takes up the space between the building and the sidewalk. I should say, parenthetically, something that you're seeing in this, you've already figured out from these images, which was that a decision for the book that we put together was to use the extraordinary art of Los Angeles of the last 70 years, which is really to say photographs and paintings, as a way of telling our story. So we have the Hockney that you saw on the Ginder, and these incredible photographs by Ruscha. Now, Ruscha wasn't like an urban documentarian. This was the landscape of Los Angeles that he wanted to capture. And so we take advantage of that all the way through the book. Of course, with the development of the city from a city of 2 or 3 million to certainly a city of 4 million, and the urban region is about 12 or 13 million, that dream was put under incredible stress. And it's kind of funny, but not, if you think about the idea that where else would a big Hollywood movie musical open with a wonderful dance number set in a traffic jam on a freeway? Of course, the opening of La La Land, which you see here from 2016. Well, that just went to say that the traffic jam became one of the defining elements of the city as well. And along with it, the sort of growing unsustainability of the model that LA had pioneered in the 1950s and 60s. There came a point where no new freeways could be built, so the existing system has to carry the growing and growing load, to the point where traffic in Los Angeles, which kind of was a punchline or a bit of a joke in the old days, it's not a joke anymore. It really has shaped the life. And with it has come all sorts of environmental issues, most dramatically shown when you have something like the Getty Fire, caused by the fact that you've got exurban development in places that really shouldn't be developed. And you get these terrible fires, which are fed by that exurban development. But we are in a new era. I should say also, this is our first chapter of our book, and it is a chapter by Frances Anderton. And she's a good example of the kind of wonderful observer. She's a longtime observer, originally born in England, but longtime observer of the Los Angeles scene. And she historicizes for us this great struggle between the car and the accoutrement of the car and other things. Since 2001 or 2 or whatever you want to call it, all kinds of new things have started to happen in Los Angeles, as they have in other cities. But it's been pushed forward, I'd say, in Los Angeles in interesting ways. Of course, you have the rise of Uber and Lyft and Revel and all the ride-sharing activities. This has really transformed things. Travel, for example, you used to go to the Hertz counter at LAX. It was mobbed. You go there now, and it's often empty, because visitors to the city are going, why should I rent a car when there's this system that will take me anywhere I want to go and roughly costs about the same amount of money? And downtown LA, which you're seeing on the left here, has boomed in part. We'll talk about other reasons, but one of the reasons is that young people in LA who used to have to get their driver's license when they were 16 now are beginning to lose their automatic connection to the car. They can go downtown and come back using Uber and Lyft. But there's also kinds of other things happening, including the rise of rideshare, of scooters, of e-bikes, things that you don't have to buy. You can just pick them up on the sidewalk. In places like Santa Monica, they are the way that people get around. And that's all also tech enabled. And of course, although many people outside the city don't realize, Los Angeles is in the middle of an extraordinary infrastructure boom involving public transit. It is building the largest mass transit system in North America, seen since the effective end of the construction of the New York subway in 1940, when the IND subway was finished. It is building out this enormous system. It's been building since about 1990. It continues to expand. Here you see one of the new tunnels being driven. It's a combination of heavy rail underground, of light rail above ground, sometimes lifted on to elevated structure, but sometimes at surface level. And it's changing the city in two ways. Yes, people are using it, and more people are using it. Some of the lines, like the Expo line, the one that goes to the beach from downtown, has gotten very popular. Young people time their trips to meet on the train on their way to the beach, and they all get on the same stop. So the party, not the same stop, but they get on the same train on different stops. So the party starts on the train and takes them all the way down to the Santa Monica beaches. But it's had another very important impact, which is the more subtle one, which is that it has allowed Los Angeles to change its zoning rules near transit stops and allow for densification. That may end up being as big or bigger a change that the system is built. Now they've accelerated the development of the system toward the 2028 Olympics, and it will be built out substantially by then. So this is the new Los Angeles. It's a place which has a rail system which takes you from one part of the city to the other. It's got development, which includes both what anyone would call genuine high-rise development. You see the building in the back there. More commonly, you have what is known as the 5/1 type of construction, which is usually about 4 or 5 stories of multifamily dwellings, which are stick-built. That's the 5 zoning, that's construction category 5, sitting over a first floor of reinforced concrete where the usually shops and lobbies and sometimes parking is. That's the 1 classification. I thought it was 5 stories over 1, but it's construction category 5 over construction category 1, which has become the regnant form, the new form of construction in Los Angeles. There are 10 new multifamily units now being given permits for every 1 single family unit that's built. There are so many interesting implications of also what's coming down the line. We'll talk in a minute about EVs, but autonomous vehicles, they're not here yet. When they come, there's a lot of thought that you may not own a autonomous vehicle. Why bother? Just like an Uber without a driver, it will come to you, it will take you where you want to go, and it will go away and park. It does not need to park in downtown. So that's what you're seeing on the right. So what impact will that have on parking regulations? And of course, the much sooner rise in EVs. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 of our book is a conversation with Eric Avila. He is a professor at UCLA in both Chicano studies and urban planning. And he takes us back a little to remind us of what the human cost of that dream was, to build that freeway system in particular, and to build all that tract housing, particularly in areas, underprivileged areas and working class areas of the city, not far from downtown, which basically saw their infrastructure destroyed. And we put together these 2 photographs, which I've never seen quite connected this way. On the right is a beautiful painting by Wayne Thiebaud, another artist fascinated by mobility in Los Angeles. On the left is a shot of one of the great downtown freeways, I think it's 10, being constructed. And it gives you a flavor of what had to happen in order for that view on the right to occur. You had to rip through miles and miles of densely populated districts. So he reminds us about that, and then moves on to talk to us about the cultural impact of it. He shows us the way that a certain kind of artist, well, to put it kind of bluntly, white artists, saw the great freeway system. This is Ansel Adams on the left, seeing this extraordinary construction as a beautiful abstract vision, basically. And then he shows us the way that Chicano artists saw people who lived in Boyle Heights, for example, onto which these freeways were being built. So instead of looking at it from the top down, they looked at it from the bottom up, and gave them this sort of extraordinary different way of seeing. And most remarkably for me, this is a group of artists I was not aware of. He introduced me to the work of Carlos Almaraz, a Chicano artist. He sadly died of AIDS in the late 1980s. Before he did, he painted these spectacular paintings. This one I believe is called Longo Crash. Another one is called Sunset Crash. And these in kind of apocalyptic visions of the freeway as so capturing the rage of some populations towards this new construction. We survey in a chapter by Greg Lindsay the new technologies, and then we start to show you the impact that they're all having in different ways on the form of LA. And in doing so, we try to give you, well, we can't give you a comprehensive view of LA. It's too big a city for that. But what we do give you is an impressionistic view of many of the more interesting parts of the city and the way they're changing. And this is a fascinating project called Destination Crenshaw. It's being developed in the historically Black Crenshaw neighborhood, which is north of LAX, and it's being redeveloped because they're building and just about to open a new metro connector with the rest of the system to LAX, which will be, of course, a terrific thing. Will allow LA to join the world group of cities, which only kind of half includes New York, of cities where the airport is properly connected to the transit system. But it did mean the creation of a transit line going down the middle of Crenshaw Boulevard, shades of the old freeway development, but not in this case, because they developed a really wonderful and extraordinary idea to use the circumstance of the rebuilding of Crenshaw Boulevard to create a 1.3 mile long arts corridor, which would be filled with public art and plazas and other kinds of spaces. Here's an example of, that's a sculpture by Kehinde Wiley, the legendary, wonderful artist. He did, of course, the great portrait of Barack Obama. That is the official portrait. And it will be a 1.3 mile long, basically open arts museum highlighting Black culture and Black public art. And it's under construction right now, and will be opening in a couple of years. And it seemed to us a fascinating example of how transit and development can go together in interesting ways. Another place we looked at where transit and development mobility and development are so fascinating is the Sunset Strip. It's LA's Times Square, but instead of a place that you look at as a pedestrian does at Times Square, it's a place you look at through movement. And of course, it's famous for its oversized billboards and wallboards, which, in addition to being a really kind of spectacular environment in themselves, sort of take the temperature of the entertainment industry in Los Angeles. Who's up, who's down, who's getting a lot of play with their record company or their film company. Now, for those of us in the architecture world, the idea of the big billboard on top of the little building inevitably connects us to some pretty rich modern thinking, notably that of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, who talked about the decorated shed, the ordinary building with the giant billboard. And in Los Angeles, of course, that taking the idea of the kind of armature of public entertainment through that marvelous shot of the door, the kind of overscale, the idea that the overscaled figures of Hollywood and the music business have their kind of overscaled equivalent, quite similar in a way to Times Square. This was done in the context of a case study project that Woods Bagot developed to take that idea of the big decorated shed idea and bring it into the future using LEDs. And Matt Ducharme worked on this project to take a parking lot and develop it as a state-of-the-art kind of open space, the ground level of which could be many things, including, let's say, a food truck court, but then would have this remarkable structure with LEDs, full video motion. So that seemed another interesting project. So part two of our book is from parking to places. So this was the core of the thinking of the book. What could we do and how could we think about specifically about parking and about the way that parking related to the development of the city? And this was the core, the original study we did, which was called More LA back in 2018. You go around LA and you see a lot of surface parking, and you go, I wonder what you could do with that, particularly if as you need less parking as you move into the future. Well, Woods Bagot had their data teams had the capability to literally map every single surface parking lot in Los Angeles. We decided to focus on this core area as the area where it would really make a difference. Los Angeles, there's a whole lot of historical reasons about the strange map of the city and county of Los Angeles. There you see everything that's highlighted there is a surface parking lot. Now, you do see these random numbers. You see 200 square miles of parking in Los Angeles, but it's a meaningless number because it includes curbside parking and includes sheltered parking in structures, underground parking. Well, you can't build anything on a curbside lot, parking space, and can't build. It's too expensive to tear down sheltered parking, structured parking, and rebuild it. We looked at surface parking lots of 5,000 square feet or more. We didn't count industrial spaces, so not to get into the whole problem of sort of blue collar employment. And what we determined was there, get ready, 25.4 square miles of surface parking in the core of the metro area, basically Los Angeles Basin, an area larger than the size of Manhattan. We also, as we did it, did some fascinating mapping projects. We mapped the bus network of Los Angeles and its catchment, which you see there in meters. And then we did the metro area and its catchment, and you can see actually much thinner in a way. But then we did an interesting exercise, Metro and Uber, a $7 Uber cab ride to the metro station. A big problem of Los Angeles is what's known as the last mile problem. You take the train, whereas in New York, you get off and you're 2 blocks or 3 blocks from your destination. You might be half a mile or 3/4 of a mile from your home. How do you solve that? Well, one idea we had was that Uber could be the solution to the metro problem. You go just a very brief, quick ride to your nearest metro station, and then you take the long ride across the city on the metro, avoiding the traffic jams. We went beyond in this parking study. We actually looked at kind of prototypical sites along boulevards, downtown, and we actually analyzed how much development could you build, and that's where we came up with those numbers. We looked at development that would be at the same density as the surrounding density. In other words, no skyscrapers in single-family districts, and we came up with these astonishing numbers. Basically, you could build 1.5 million new housing for 1.5 million new people, developing the parking lots of Los Angeles. Now, for those who say, come on, LA, you have to have all that parking. You can't imagine the city without it. We have an extraordinary real world example to point to, and that's downtown Los Angeles. Downtown Los Angeles has had the most impressive renaissance of any downtown area in the United States, probably in 60 years, since around 2000. And why? Well, one of the reasons people don't understand it, we should explain that downtown Los Angeles was a very booming, bustling area in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, when, let's say, Safety Last, the wonderful Harold Lloyd movie, was made, which everybody remembers, the Harold hanging off the clock. Well, that's downtown Los Angeles, not New York. And the view on the right gives you an idea, which shows you Broadway, shows you how densely developed it was with, genuine buildings, not towering skyscrapers, but 12 and 13 story steel frame, elevator propelled buildings. And it went into a long period of decline after the city sort of expanded outward, but it is booming again. And one of the reasons it is booming, in fact, the primary reason it is booming, arguably, is because Los Angeles passed something called the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance in about 1999. There was a lot of interest in reusing these wonderful historic buildings for residences, much like New York had done in Soho and had become the fashion all over the United States and elsewhere. But there was a problem, which was that if the existing parking regulations stayed in place, which called for 2 spaces per unit or more, you could never do it, because where were you going to put the parking? You couldn't put parking into the basement of an existing building. So what they did was they loosened up the requirements by making them flexible. They said, okay, you still need some parking. It doesn't have to be in your building. It could be down the street. It could be nearby. They let the developer decide how much and how to create the parking for their project. And with the result that something like 12,000 units were converted in a period of about 7 or 8 years. And suddenly, from this sort of deteriorating, declining downtown district, you have one of the most booming and bustling downtowns with these marvelous historic buildings going anywhere from the World War I to the really World War II. You see the beautiful Art Deco Eastern building on the right, being turned into condominiums. And here you have the life of one of the hotels there. We next have a chapter on the really complex and problematic, but now fascinating relationship of parking and housing. Of course, Los Angeles, like New York, housing is one of its, if not its greatest problem, and for a similar reason. It's the price of success. More people want to live in the city than the city has housing for. Immigrants, young people, people of all kinds, retired people, everybody wants to come to Los Angeles and New York. They're both successful cities, but it has a real consequence, and that is that housing has gotten incredibly expensive, and some people can't afford housing at all. Now, we have a chapter by Mark Valianatis that explores why this is true, and he explains to us that before parking regulations were put in place around the time of World War II, there was a huge amount of variation in the housing, including blocks that look very much like a New York block, which you see here on Normandy, near Normandy Avenue, which allowed for multiple dwellings. This is not downtown. This is near the so-called Miracle Mile in Wilshire. As time went on in the 20s and 30s, the idea of the garage arrived and the parking regulations began to creep up. They had originally been parking maximums. You couldn't have more than a certain amount of parking. They became parking minimums. You needed to have at least one off-street parking space. Then it was 1.5, then it was 2. Along the way, you got some interesting variations like these wonderful Dunesmere apartment modernist project from the 1930s. By after World War II, the parking requirements had gotten so large that you couldn't geometrically fit the housing and the parking on the same lot. So what did they do? They lifted the housing a full floor up and turned over the entire base of the building to parking. And that's what you see. This is a type of housing unique to Los Angeles, which is colloquially known as the dingbat. And these were usually 3-story buildings, usually frame construction. And as you see the shot, another Rouchet shot on the left, they basically entire first floor is parking. Did not make for great urbanism because you basically are walking by parking lots as you go. There's a layout of it. And of course, brought us to the terrible place that Los Angeles is in now, like New York, homeless, but more visible than in New York. And in part because of the good weather, everybody is outside. But in a chapter that I prepared, I wanted to use an example of what we thought a very interesting solution to this problem might be. There is a heritage in Los Angeles of the extraordinary courtyard projects that were developed from the time of World War I to the time of World War II, basically. These are multiple dwellings that are laid out around these beautifully landscaped courtyards, and they were made possible because you only had to have one or fewer parking space, off-street parking spaces. The original ones were called bungalow courts. You see there on the left, and you see one on the right that's a courtyard project, and you see one of the enormous advantages that they had, and we think still have, is that because of their shape, you see the way they're shaped like U's, and they only touch the street with the sort of ends of the U's, so that from the street, they look like houses. This is a very touchy issue because Los Angeles, so much of the opposition to development in Los Angeles, then and now, is that they don't want projects that are out of character, that are out of scale for their single family historic districts. And these projects showed that, in fact, you could densify dramatically. You could get 8 units on what had been 1 or 2 single family lots if you developed them this way. And they took advantage of the fact that you had to have only one off-street parking space, if that. And there you see indeed, for one of the early projects, the single off-street parking. And people live there today and love them, and they have only one parking space, and that's fine with them. They wouldn't live anywhere else. And when you look at the shot on the left, you understand why. It's incredible. It's a sort of, you walk into these courtyards and you're immersed in kind of Ur, California experience, where the planting, the irrigation, the water, the sweep of the trees and the breeze, the orange trees, everything that people dreamed and loved about California is somehow summarized in these projects, which are nonetheless multiple dwelling units. I thought perhaps we could do these today. I should say that the ones that have survived, this one's become, it's called San Vicente Bungalows. These are like the most expensive places to rent or spend the night, the Chateau Marmont. These are, incredibly attractive. People love them. So the thought occurred to us, why couldn't we do these today? And so we developed our own project for a modern day courtyard, which would have many of the same qualities that the old courtyards had, which was the shared, richly landscaped central court. An important aspect of these projects was that everyone had their own front door. These are not apartment houses where you go down a long corridor. You have your own house. It has a front yard and a backyard. And it happens that the front yard falls onto meets onto the courtyard. But otherwise, it has all the pleasures of a single family California house. And here we was, I won't spend a ton of time on this. And it recreates that value that we talked about in the old projects, which is when it's time to meet the street, it does so with two-story structures, widely separated from each other, set back from the sidewalk with planting, and recreates or extends the iconography and the feel of a single family neighborhood. So you could put them in single family projects. Here's the interior. There's a detail. The third part of the book, and we're almost done now with this, is called Recharge LA. And this is what emerged from the conversations and the not challenge, but the opportunity that was offered us by Christopher Hawthorne in 2020. And that was to think about this. Governor Newsom of California has declared that there will be no gasoline-powered cars or trucks sold on the roads of California, sold in the state of California by 2035, 11 years from now, in planning terms, the blink of an eye. So the question was, what will happen to all those gas stations? The city of Los Angeles has 550 gas stations. That's the city limits, not the region, which is about 3 times bigger and has 3 times as many gas stations. They are, as you often find in Los Angeles, they sit on corners, so they are in what might be called the 100% locations, and they very often have another gas station across the street. They're large lots, they're well-sized for other uses. They do have obviously some environmental issues and that the land underneath them is often contaminated, but they would be very, very good properties to reuse once we don't need to fill our cars with gas, and that day is coming rather soon. So once again, Woods Bagot's data teams jumped into the fray, and we did an analysis of where are those sites, what kind of neighborhoods are they in, what are the development considerations for those neighborhoods in terms of land use, density, zoning, et cetera. How do they stand, among other things, in relation to Olympic sites in 2028, you see at the bottom. And we developed this fascinating thing, not quite as dramatic, but this is going to happen tomorrow, which is that you could house 40,000 people in new development at prevailing densities on gas station sites in the city of Los Angeles. And here were some concepts for new kinds of development of various kinds, which could include park space, landscape, recreation, housing, mixed use, you name it. And the final project, and the one that we're going to be talking about a little bit more with Matt Ducharme, was to look at a single site. This again was Christopher Hawthorne's concept as an interim to think about a single gas station being turned into an EV station. Of course, EV charging takes longer than gas pumping, which means you might be able to do other things while you get your gas pumped. And one of the things that we wanted to explore, and Matt will talk about this at length, was this idea of the gas station, the role that the car has played in the culture of Los Angeles. And here you see a wonderful photograph of Julius Schulman on the left and an Ed Ruscha painting on the right. And I'm not going to talk about it here because Matt's going to give us a little presentation about this very provocative and interesting project, which is based on these uses. And that's our book, basically. So I'm going to now turn it over to Matt Ducharme. Matt is the West Coast design leader for Woods Bagot. He's based in Los Angeles, does projects in California. You can look at your biographies, a former architect from Shop Architects. Many of you know those great guys. And he was the person tasked with coming up with some of these really interesting ideas. So Matt, take it away.
Well, thank you, James. We do like to make it complicated by having two Matts. So I'm the Matt from Los Angeles, formerly from New York, relapsed New Yorker. As James mentioned, within the book, what we looked at is more kind of expansive case studies, but then looking at specific sites. So the project that I'm going to walk you through here is actually the last case study in the book, and this was really a symposium that Christopher Hawthorne had put together in 2020 during the pandemic, and so we were looking at the 550 gas stations throughout the city of Los Angeles, and as James mentioned, our data teams were understanding what could be the future of development for those sites. In this particular project that we're talking about, we actually looked at a very specific site. And what becomes very interesting is that provocation that James brought up is, what do you do during that moment when you're actually charging your car, because it's not instantaneous? And so for us, that became a much broader question about the implications of the mobility or the automobile and culture itself. What are we going to do with these sites so that they could be multifaceted and multi-use? Because it's no longer the volatile chemicals at the gas station. You could actually have a number of different activities throughout the day. So this becomes very interesting when we look at the implications or the impact of mobility in the city of Los Angeles. This idea of pump to plug or recharge LA, which we call this particular project. And you can see here, somewhat tongue in cheek, but not really, looking at Back to the Future to the left. There's a broader implication on what mobility and what the automobile has meant to the city of Los Angeles. And so for us, what we were looking at is, of course, what happens when the technologies are allowing us for more sustainable solutions, but then how do you actually plug into culture with that? How does the change in that technology allow for us an entirely new opportunity? Because when we look back to what the gas station, for instance, used to be, it actually used to be about a democratization of mobility. And there was all of the excitement around what that could be and how that could be accessed for everyone. And so we said, well, with this new technology, with the EV charging in this particular case, is there a new opportunity for plugging into culture? And so you look at the iconography of the gas station and the Googie architecture here, and James had mentioned the decorated shed. Everything is viewed from the rear view mirror at 40 miles an hour. So these buildings themselves actually became a really a representation or an advertisement for what their use case was. And can we tap back into that? But really importantly, what has the automobile meant for the representation of each of these cultures? So a huge aspect of the creativity of the communities that we're actually looking at, in this case, the 58 Impala, that was basically a representation of new people coming to the city of Los Angeles and actually showing their creativity through the automobile. The lowriders were actually a response to the police actually targeting these communities so that they actually had the hydraulics when the police officers would come, that the car could go up, but then it becomes so much more. And you see how a technology like this can be representative of so much more. And then actually, how can you take something like the billboard or the sign that we were looking at, and how can that be actually reappropriated? This actually is my children's favorite slide in the deck, because they don't understand why Mickey and Minnie are dancing with this woman, but this is actually a representation of Banksy actually taking over a billboard. And this is a real opportunity for the display of art and community. So thinking about the different surfaces and the technology of this particular site, and actually having multifaceted and multivariate use and almost a layering of use cases. So the ground, thinking of it more than just something that you're driving on top of, but as the technology is progressing, can it have inductive charging? And because the technology is progressing in a particular way, can you also have a park surface as well, not just a parking lot? Or the canopy that very necessarily is blocking the sunlight because it's very warm in Los Angeles during the summer especially. Can that also be actually collecting energy, but then also moving into different positions and projecting out media as well? And of course, we'd be remiss to talk about Los Angeles and not talk about the influence of oh, am I too close? Yeah, I'm leaning forward to not talk about the soundstage, and thinking about all of the creativity that's associated with that soundstage, which is just a very simple infrastructural element that when you actually adjust everything within it, that's where the creativity comes, and that's where the excitement comes. And using new technology, can you actually create an immersive environment from that? So one of the things that we were tasked with was not only to look at this in one moment in time, because these technologies are progressing so fast, but actually project them into the future. So in one instance where you're going to a discrete charging point today. In the future, actually, you could have inductive charging in the ground plane, and that actually allows you to do something much more flexible with the site. And as we know, actually activating these sites throughout the day and throughout the year in different ways is the way in which they can be very useful, not only to the community, but also to those that are owning the site and activating the site as well. So what we see here is looking at an opportunity for anything from charging your car in the most base instance, which is what we were really asked to look at, but then actually using the idea of the food truck culture and actually plugging into the canopies that are actually collecting energy throughout the day, but then actually repositioning the screen itself that was collecting energy and creating a drive-in movie theater at night, or even a car meet. So one of the other aspects of all of this is that the public square of Los Angeles is actually the parking lot. The Piazza Nirvana is what we would typically, or Bryant Park, or any number of places what we would typically think of where community is coming together in Los Angeles. In fact, people are coming together in that flat surface, and can this be a further projection of that? So these design studies look at combining those ideas together, a very particular site where we have the EV charging in its basis case, and people are coming together during the day and using the scaffolding as a means to block the sunlight, but then collect energy. But then at different times of night, because you're collecting that energy, you're actually able to reposition the digital billboard in a way so that it's actually reinforcing the activity or the behavior that's happening at night. And so we look at that during the day. The food truck culture, which James and the team have talked about quite a bit. There's a huge food culture around these food trucks that move around the city. Go figure, in Los Angeles, that becomes a large part of what this could be. So we, as a team, put together different instances of what can this mean as a representation of culture, and almost thinking about this as a museum or gallery in certain instances, but then at night it actually becomes where the car meet is occurring. So you're actually tricking out your car, and this can be a further projection of all of that. And we would be remiss if we weren't showing the incredible impact of not only Ryan Gosling, but car culture in movies, and how actually, if you even think about the Fast and the Furious, how that was actually the kind of lineage from these communities that we're actually representing and tricking out their cars. That becomes a part of our media and culture in Los Angeles and projected out to the world.
So great.
Yeah.
Thank you,
I did that
Matt.
quickly.
Okay, you did it well. One thing I don't think I really made properly clear, I was thinking about it, is a little elliptical about the adaptive reuse ordinance, the ARO, and that is that it zeroed out the parking requirement, so that it basically said there'd be no minimum required for these historic buildings, or these pre-war buildings that were turned into residential units. And people were like, will that work? And it turned out it did. And the answer was, as Michael Manville, who I did a Q&A with in the book, who is a professor at UCLA, who's the world's expert on this downtown phenomenon, basically said that what happened was that it did work by the developers thinking through all the different scenarios that they could think through. You could use existing parking lots that were near the building. You could decide yourself how much parking was necessary, because one of the phenomenon that he noted and others have noted is that modern families don't necessarily need to have 2 to 3 cars. They may definitely want to have 1 car, because in LA that's still pretty useful. But one of them may be commuting by rail, one of them may be working at home. And so they're perfectly happy to have off-street parking for a single car. And of course, this has enormous implications for housing, because structured parking is incredibly expensive. It's something like, or when we did the book, it was like $80,000 per space. So, imagine every space that you don't build, you have another $80,000 to build housing, meaning you can build that just that much more. So it's kind of revolutionary. The city is now looking to extend it to non-historic building renovations, so that any new construction downtown, of course, downtown is the best served by transit, and it is the most dense, and it is the place that you most likely can walk easily to a restaurant or stores or anything else like that. But that the notion would be that any new construction would not have to have, by fiat, would not have to have a certain number of housing. What you get in downtown Los Angeles, you sort of get elsewhere, is the so-called tower on a podium, where the first 5 floors of the building are taken up by by parking, because that's, if you really are going to have 2.3 spaces per unit, that's how much parking you're going to need. And then the building starts above that. Not great urbanism, once again, to look up at a building and basically see the headlights of cars coming through the concrete. So it's a great innovation, and it's really happening. And it's now being extended through this, what they call transit-oriented development. Well, they call it transit-oriented communities, the same as our TOD, which basically builds a bullseye around each of the transit stations and says within, I forget the exact number, it's something like within 1,000 feet, you have to have no parking whatsoever by law. You can put it in if you want to, but you don't have to have it. 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet, one space per unit. Go out beyond that, you're doing 1.5 spaces and so forth. You work your way back up to the basic requirement, which is roughly 2 spaces per unit. Are we ready now?
I found Scott Johnson's third question. I think you already dealt with the second one in your answers. But he asks, how can you describe the effect such disparate distances and travel times characteristic of the LA region, those effects they have on the concepts of community and neighborhood definition in the minds of its residents?
That's a good question. It's a common, in doing this book, and I'll let Matt jump in as well, because he's been really living it. But I can tell you that as someone who's traveled between the coasts, it's amazing to hear Easterners and New Yorkers in particular have this idea that Los Angeles is one undifferentiated mass, like some sci-fi movie. Neighborhood identity in Los Angeles is no less strong than it is in Manhattan. People really feel strongly about the neighborhoods they live in. They feel strongly about the kind of place they are and the kind of development that they have and what's special about them. And so it's a kind of a strange thing for an Easterner to get their head around, that even if you don't have the little high street, so to speak, that nonetheless you have a pretty strong sense of district and neighborhood identity and sense of community. So people do not describe themselves first and foremost as living in LA. They live in Santa Monica, they live in Culver City, they live in Westwood, they live in the community they live. As a New Yorker would say, well, I'm in, whatever, Bay Ridge, or I'm in, the Upper East Side, or whatever. What's your take on this? Someone who's actually made the move.
I completely agree. I think the thing that I would actually add to that, and Greg Lindsay's piece really speaks to it, is the opportunity for multimodality of transportation. So yes, you have these distinctive communities that had been connected through the freeway. Now you have other opportunities to actually get in between a lot more seamlessly. So you actually have electric bikes, for instance. So you don't necessarily need to get in your car to get from one of these little group cities, 88 incorporated cities within the city of Los Angeles, from one to the next. You can actually use these other forms of transportation to get in between, not least of which actually going and using an Uber and rideshare as well. So I completely agree with that. There's a character within each of it, within each of these little incorporated cities. And honestly, I think of it as New York, with each neighborhood being very distinct, except it's just a little bit more spread out.
There you go. Are there some questions coming in from
there is one, but I think this last question gives me the opportunity to plug our next talk, which is on February 20th by a historian, an urban historian, Becky Nicolaitis, who has done a book on the new suburbia. Based in LA, and looking at neighborhoods and diversity. So the subtitle is Diversity. She has a long-term 20-year demographic analysis of the changing and more diverse populations of LA. And maybe you could speak to that. You talked mostly about the Hispanic and Chicano influences in the culture, but maybe a little bit more about some of the mix of racial identities that you find.
Do you want to?
Well, Los Angeles, like New York, is infinitely complicated in that way. It is as diverse as New York. It has, if you add up the different nationalities represented in the city, you get a number something like New York, which is like 170. Amazing number. Just about every country in the world is represented in LA. You have enormous subpopulations that are the size of cities. And in many cases of like we'd say in New York, the largest Irish outside of Dublin. You have not dissimilar things. You obviously have this enormous Latino population, but you have, for example, an enormous, just to pick something at random, Eastern European population. When you get in a Uber, your driver is very likely to be a Russian immigrant and or Polish or something like that. It proved very popular. You have a big Israeli population. You have just very rich, diverse groups. Now, how those groups interact, well, they're the usual, culinary is always one big one. Obviously, people with kind of diversity of foods. Are there tensions about who lives where and who can move where? Sure. And let's just be really frank, are the fears about development, which are framed as often as physical things? We don't want big buildings in our neighborhood. Are those maybe code words for certain other kinds of people we don't want in our neighborhood? Maybe, as they often are in New York as well. In particular, in I think the challenge in Los Angeles, getting back to the physical, is that whereas it really comes down to what we call the missing middle, whereas the things we know how to do are single family houses and big apartment houses, which are big enough to have their own parking. What we've not been strong at, and only are sort of coming back to since the end of World War II, is the idea of dense but not overwhelmingly tall multiple dwelling projects. That's sort of 5/1 units. You have fierce NIMBY opposition. Everybody, I'm guessing here, knows what I mean by NIMBY. 10 times worse in a way than New York, because the power structure of Los Angeles, this is a big difference, is very decentralized. Unlike New York, where the mayor is incredibly powerful, and then the governor and the 5 borough New York City agencies carry a lot of power if you want to use them. Power in Los Angeles devolves to 10 community councilors, basically, area councilors. And it's the council that has the power. The mayor has some power, and more as time has gone by. But much of the power, specifically the funding power of Los Angeles, is in these 10 communities, these 10 districts, each of which multi-city of 4 million people. So the average size of these council people's areas is 400,000 people, which means, would be the 15th biggest city in the United States, each of them. It's easier to fight things because of that decentralized form. Whereas the city can decide, New York City can decide at the city level that it needs housing here or there, harder to do in Los Angeles. And Francis Anderton in particular is very alert to the incredible fierceness with which any kind of multiple dwelling, any kind of development is shot down. And it's important to remember that something like 62% of the residential zone land of Los Angeles to this day is zoned for single family. That's by area, not by population. Most of the city is still zoned for single family. You go in and try to change that, even on a block, otherwise perfectly suited for it, and you will be facing one, big angry mob of people who are not going to be happy about that.
However, I mean, what I am heartened by is actually what James had written about in the book, is actually the destination Crenshaw, where there's actually lessons learned from what historically had just been absolutely splitting apart communities through the freeway, as James had talked about earlier. So the idea that when we're looking at this new transportation corridor, and actually it can be a celebration of community as opposed to separating it, I think that is part of the strength in what James has been writing about in the book, is that we look to the past and we actually project to the future, and that this can actually be a means to celebrate as opposed to divide.
That's a great example of the council system working at its best, because Marquise Harris Dawson, the council member of the Crenshaw area district, when the announcement was made that this line was going to go through to go to LAX from the rest of the system going down Crenshaw, instead of saying, well, let's just try to fight this thing, try to fight Metro, LA Metro, which is the big metropolitan area equivalent of the MTA, he was like, no, let's be creative and imaginative. And he worked with LA Metro to develop this idea. And then, importantly, he could access funding to build it. That would be hard for a council person in New York City to do. Whereas he could really mobilize some real dollars, and then get Karen Bass, who represented the district in Congress in those days, to get some federal money for the project, and they could get it built. This is tens of millions of dollars we're talking about. And Karen, of course, Bass has now become the mayor of Los Angeles.
Well, speaking of zoning, speaking of government federal subsidies and zoning and single and multifamily. We have a question from Wendy Price Todd, who says, will property values allow for low-rise or mid-rise residential or mixed-use redevelopment without a public subsidy to achieve 120% or less of median family income? But leaving aside, let's just call it affordable housing. What is the mechanism by which affordable housing can enter in a larger percentage?
It's a problem in LA. I would say that this is, with all due respect and love of that city, it is not a strength. There's almost no equivalent in Los Angeles of the very long and powerful heritage in New York, for example, of building subsidized housing, where since, Carol, you and I know, since the 1870s and 80s, but really since the 1930s, the idea that the fair market insufficiencies to build affordable housing, which was a problem, it's not a new problem in New York City or Los Angeles. There were well-established mechanisms, many of which don't work quite the way they used to, haven't since Richard Nixon, but nonetheless, there are a series of well-established mechanisms by which affordable housing can be developed in New York and some other cities like New York. Los Angeles is, with its more focus on private enterprise and more of a focus away from an activist government, struggles with this. And so they're all kinds of great projects, very often community generated. They often are doing really interesting work with some terrific young architects and others. And so they're great. And you look at them and they're beautiful and wonderful. For a city of 4 million, and the size of the housing problem of a city of 4 million, they are not exactly drops in the bucket, but they are, closer to that. They're wonderful small projects, but they're not going to solve the big, massive problem of affordability in LA. And not that New York has so many great answers to that either. It is a failing of the successful cities that they just can't build housing cheaply. That's the problem.
I think as well, and James had talked about this earlier, it's the impact of parking on the city as well. So when we studied the metro area and the 25 square miles of developable area and not being able to fill that in because of parking requirements, if we're talking about building density but not building too vertical, that has a huge impact on it. If we don't actually solve for the area that's there, it makes it quite difficult to build the amount of housing that's required. I mean, I was reading that in order to keep prices at the current level, which aren't affordable, you'd have to build 30,000 housing units a year, and they built 6,000 affordable last year on a goal for 12,000.
Yeah. Now there's some new interesting ideas percolating up, and one of them, well, you saw the development along the Expo line. That was what we were showing with that 5-story and then 6-story and then 30-story building. Lots of that is happening. That's all up and down the Expo line. You see all over Los Angeles, you see that kind of project being built. Now, those are usually pretty much market rate, but it's adding housing to the housing stock. So every person there is not fighting with everybody else. And though that's beyond parking regulations, that it's also setback laws and all kinds of other zoning requirements that are, and fire code and so forth. Another really promising avenue for them is the ADU idea, the accessory dwelling unit. So that's the idea, as we showed in the show, that part of the development of Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s and beyond was that every house would have a garage, its own garage. Now, there's some amazing numbers of how often is a garage used to house a car? About 1 in 10 garages actually are used for housing cars. So the idea that you could convert that garage into an accessory dwelling unit, a granny flat, to use the old lingo, which would have a second household under the supervision of the first household, rented out by the first household. There's no government thing involved. It was very difficult to do until about 10 years ago. They started liberalizing the laws, and about 7 years ago, really made a big change in the law. And now it's exploding. Now it's 5,000-6,000 units a year now. It's getting it in terms of permitting of new, relatively affordable housing would be perfect for a young family. And of course, you can imagine quite quickly, you can't argue that it changes the character of the neighborhood because it's the same old garage building that you had before. It's just got a new second household living in. So that's one law change that's been very promising.
I mean, there have been a lot of arguments about the efficacy of that law, but I can tell you it's a great place to put your mother.
There you go. It's just started. it's just the beginning.
Okay, so as we wrap up, we have one last question, and it comes from Con Howe, who's
Oh, boy.
in LA at the moment and
Okay.
was formerly, he was a New Yorker and head of Manhattan office of Department of City Planning before he was lured to LA in order to become chairman of the city planning, the director of city planning there. And he sounds perhaps a little skeptical of your optimism about
Wouldn't be the
luring
first.
people from their cars. So he says, since you have observed the growing transit system in its various forms, what is your prediction of whether it will greatly succeed or not?
Well, it's succeeding in that people are taking it, and there are, you know, is it yet transformative to Los Angeles? No. It is important, and it's doing its job. If you go on the red line in the afternoon, the cars are pretty well filled. They're taking thousands of people. Those are thousands of people every train load, 10,000, I don't know, many thousands of people who are not on the highway. On that same, by the way, 101, that is one of the most crowded freeways in all of Los Angeles. It's basically a big parking lot, and so they're building it, and it is working. People are coming. Some of the lines are more popular than others. There's questions about how they built it. The Expo line, for example, has no express. It's just a local line. It stops and stops and stops and stops and stops. It takes a long time to get to the beach. And you know, as we all know, transit and development have to work as a chicken and egg kind of thing. You have to, you know, to build it, in order for the denser development to work, you have to have transit, and then, you know, you need the transit in place with the dense development. They're trying to break the logjam by basically building the system. And a lot of support of it comes from drivers, because the last thing drivers want to see is more cars on the road. And they're willing to pay for there to be an alternative, even if it's not the silver bullet, which it is not. And where we are in 10 years from now, you know, as those projects develop, as new populations come in to Los Angeles, for whom the existence of the metro is given, as opposed to the populations who are there now, for who sort of came into the car city and now this new thing. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. But it's certainly different than it was. I've been going there for 30 years. It is a different city than it was 30 years ago, dramatically different. And it is essentially a denser city, a denser and more urban in some ways city than it is.
Do you have any list? In that case, I'm going to get on camera. Hold
Our
up.
pitch later.
This book, because I'll get my head in. Well, thank you, James and Matt, and thanks to Woods Bagot for initiating the energy that James was then able to channel in the production of what is a really beautiful book. And I think everybody can see with James' slides and also Matt's presentation the enormous love and creativity and intelligence that went into their analysis and into the making of this book. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we'll see you all next time, I hope. Okay.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.